Part 6 of extracts from a diary kept by the Reverend R. Burrows during HEKE'S War in the North in 1845. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Tuesday, July 1st. Archdeacon Williams and I rode out early to the camp. As we drew near, we noticed great confusion, especially among Waka's people occupying the huts on the flat. Going into the camp, we saw that Waka's Hill was being attacked from the rear. At early dawn, or perhaps before, a party from the enemy had left their paths and had gone by a circuitous route through the bush to the back of Waka's Hill and fallen upon those who were there. Waka, not anticipating an attack from that quarter, had gone down the hill towards the camp. The colonel himself was, at the time, 2/3 of the way up the hill, directing the placing of the 32-pounder higher up. The few remaining on the hill were driven down. The soldier who was posted as a sentry over the gun was shot at his post and the flag captured. 2 women belonging to Waka's people who were in the huts were severely wounded, but managed to get down the hill to the camp. I helped to dress their wounds, which were not considered by the surgeon dangerous. The hill was very soon retaken by a detachment of the 58th, led by Major Bridge. Within half an hour after the disappearance of Waka's flag from the hill, it was seen hoisted under HEKE'S fighting flag in the Par. Hearing that Mr. H. T. Clark, who was the colonel's interpreter, and was with him on the side of the hill, had been wounded, I was on my way to look for him, when I met him being carried in a litter into the camp. After all was quiet again, Archdeacon Williams and I saw the colonel, who told us that he had decided to storm the Par that afternoon. It was no business of ours to make any remark either for or against such a step. Saw Waka, Mohi, Tawai, and other chiefs shortly afterwards. They had heard of the colonel's intention, and were warmly discussing the pros and cons for such a step. The result of their korero talk was a unanimous condemnation of the colonel's resolve. Waka, when asked what part he would take in the attack, positively refused to take any, saying it would be sending men to certain death. The colonel, seeing the native chiefs were very earnest in their talk on the subject, requested Morant, the interpreter who had taken the place of Mr. Clark, to tell him what they were saying. The interpreter, not wishing to give a literal translation of the language the chiefs were using, contented himself with informing him that they thought it an unwise step to storm the Par. But the colonel, insisting upon a literal rendering of what was being said, Morant, after some hesitation, gave it in language not to be inserted here. Suffice it to say that the opinions of Waka and the other chiefs, which they so plainly and so homely expressed, did not avail, and the storming party was told off. The point selected upon which to make the attack was the side facing Waka's Hill, at a short distance from which the ground sloped into a small gully or ravine. In this hollow the storming party were placed, and on the bugle sounding the advance they rushed to the Par, exposed to a most deadly and continuous fire from the rebels within, who reserved their fire until the advance party were under the Par. For about 10 minutes our men laboured to make a breach. Some of the sailors, among whom was Lieutenant Philpotts, climbed the outer palisading, but were driven back. The retreat was sounded, and those who were able drew off. Quite 100 had been killed and wounded in that short time. Archdeacon Williams and I made our way to the camp to be of use, if we could, in attending the wounded who were being brought off the field. At the colonel's request, Archdeacon Williams attempted to draw near the Par, carrying a white flag, the object being to obtain permission to take away the dead and wounded, but he was ordered back. It was now getting dark, and the rebels refused any parley that night. Among the missing were Captain Grant and Lieutenant Philpotts. Among the wounded were Major Macpherson, Lieutenant Beattie, and Ensign. Lieutenant Beattie, I fear, is mortally wounded. I administered to him what consolation I was able. Several poor fellows had been left on the field, 2 of whom found their way into the camp during the night. 1 or 2 others died of their wounds, or were killed by the natives. By 10 o'clock the wounded who had been brought in had been attended to by the surgeons, Archdeacon Williams rendering what help he could in dressing their wounds under the direction of the surgeons. I saw the Colonel as I was leaving for Waimate, who offered to have a bed made up for me if I chose to stay, but knowing I should not sleep if I remained in the camp, I declined, but promised to return at daylight. Wednesday, July 2nd. The Archdeacon and I left very early for the camp. At the Colonel's request, we went both together towards the Par, carrying a white flag. After a little parleying at a distance, we were allowed to approach, and no opposition was at first raised to our removing the dead, but in a short time a chief of the name of Tehara came out of the Par to say that the bodies could only be removed on the condition that the Colonel withdrew his whole force at once to the Waimate, and from thence to the bay. We replied that we did not think such a condition would be agreed to, but we could name it to the Colonel, and I was leaving to do so when we were requested to seat ourselves on a log that was lying near for a karero talk. There were present 5 or 6 of the leading chiefs, but not Kawiti. The first part of the conversation was directed to me, consisting of a story which had reached them, that I had let our blacksmith's shop to the soldiers, and that Harry Blacksmith and I were helping to make bar shot, several of which had been fired at their Par. When I asked through what channel they had obtained such information, I was told that a day or 2 previous they took one of HEKE'S men prisoner. He had made his way with others to the back of the Par, hunting for pigs, and whilst hesitating whether they should shoot him at once or take him into their Par, he had commenced giving them the information respecting the bar shot. But before he had got to the end of his story, he suddenly dashed from them. He was fired at, and his cartouche box shot away, but he himself escaped out of their hands. Of course, my only reply was that the blacksmith's shop, like all the other available buildings in the Waimate, had been taken possession of by the troops, without asking my leave, and that Harry the blacksmith had been pressed into their service. I saw that none of them had believed the prisoner's story. Much more was said by them which was foreign to the object for which we were there, namely, the obtaining possession of the dead and dying around. We were allowed to walk round and inspect the bodies, but not to touch them. I recognised those of Captain Grant and Lieutenant Philpotts lying very near to each other, close under the outer tier of defence. The latter had apparently fallen from the palisading just above where his body was lying, having been shot as he was trying to scale the Par. His eyeglass we found hanging on one of the sticks of the Par. I counted altogether about 24 bodies, soldiers, sailors, and marines. Several had been taken into the camp the night before. After spending a full hour and a half in trying to obtain permission to take away the dead, we returned to the camp, promising that one of us would come back if the Colonel had any communication to make. As we were leaving, we were asked to return next morning, even should the Colonel not agree to their proposal, when probably they would allow us to remove the dead. We were both treated with civility by them. They asked very few questions as to the loss on our side. There was no boasting. Penny Tawid, the chief of Ohaiwai, who had not joined us in our conversation, called to us from within the Par, saying, "Under any circumstances you will be allowed to take away the tupapakus (the dead bodies) tomorrow morning. Come early." We reported the particulars of our interview to the Colonel, who of course did not agree to the proposal of the rebels. At our suggestion, however, he agreed to remain quiet till after we had paid our next visit in the morning. After seeing Lieutenant Beattie and a few of the most severely wounded in hospital, we rode back to the Waimate, I being scarcely able to sit my horse on account of a very severe headache. Thursday, July 3rd. We both rose before daylight, the Archdeacon intending to ride with me to the camp, and then go on to the bay, as he was desirous to send away to Auckland as speedily as possible a correct account of what had taken place. but I found myself too ill to venture on horseback, and the Archdeacon pressed me to remain quietly at home, and he would go out and see to anything which we might be wanted to do. Before he arrived there, a white flag had been hoisted in the Par, and a messenger sent to say the bodies might be removed. We had taken the precaution to send out 4 or 5 of our own natives, in case of the rebels objecting to the soldiers, or any of Waka's people going close up to the Par. These had removed a number of the dead before Archdeacon Williams arrived, and in a short time all were brought into camp. Feeling better after a sleep, I followed about midday, and found that the bodies, numbering over 30 altogether, were being placed in one grave, which had been prepared for the purpose, over which the Archdeacon performed the funeral service. On the day previous I had tried to ascertain the loss sustained by the enemy, but they were careful to hide the numbers. Several bodies of chiefs had been taken away. I saw them opening graves behind the Par for 4 or 5. Perhaps about 10 or 11 killed, and about double that number wounded, would be near the mark. We saw those of the wounded soldiers who were too ill to be removed. As many as we could prepare room for, and who were able to be removed, have been brought into the Waimate today. The body of Lieutenant Philpotts has also been brought in and interred in our burying ground. Friday and Saturday, July the 4th and 5th. No attack has been made on the Par since Tuesday, nor have the rebels molested the troops. Yesterday the remainder of the wounded who could be removed into our settlement were brought in, among whom is Lieutenant Beattie, who, I fear, will not recover. The less severely wounded, who are not likely to be of any use in the field for some time to come, and who were able to walk so far, have gone to the Kerry Kerry, to proceed from thence on board the transports lying in the river. A report reached us today that Haratua, who, contrary to all our expectations, has recovered from the wound he received on the day Heke was wounded, is meditating a night visit to the Waimate to burn down all the buildings. This is not without some foundation, for the proposal has been made. The idea that between 20 and 30 of the worst wounded who are lying helpless on their mattresses in the large playroom may be burnt in their beds has harassed me so that I could not sleep all last night. I therefore wrote a note to the Colonel this morning, suggesting that if possible some 20 or 30 men might be sent in as a guard. I afterwards saw him, and towards evening Captain Balnevis arrived with about 20 men. The captain, acting upon my suggestion, placed them around the house in which the wounded were lying, there being an old carpenter's shop at one end where they could take shelter from the weather. The second large building and barn, which are some 150 yards off in a different direction, we leave to the care of 10 or 12 of our neutral natives, who at my request have agreed to mount guard during the night. Both the sick and their guard are inside a close boarded fence 6 feet high, which encloses the buildings. Sunday, July the 6th. The Reverend J. Matthews having put in his appearance last night, I was only too glad to take a rest by leaving the 2 native services to him today. No church parade at the camp. In the evening a native arrived from Kaikohe with a message to me not to venture again near the Par, as Kawiti was angry with me for preventing the destruction of the Waitangi bridge, and thus affording facilities to the troops to bring in their large guns to Ohahiwai. The same messenger also told me that communications were going on between Heke and Kawiti in reference to deserting the Par. Monday, July the 7th. Left early for the camp. On my arrival I was met by Captain Wilmot of the artillery and Mr. Clendon, magistrate of the Hokianga district, who informed me that the whole force was about to be withdrawn to the Waimate, there to wait for reinforcements from Sydney and Melbourne. Captain Wilmot pressed me to use my influence with the Colonel to prevent such a step. I went as usual to report myself to the Colonel, accompanied by Mr. Clendon. On our way to the tent we noticed nearly the whole camp busy in preparing for a move. After the usual salutations, the Colonel told us his intentions. Mr. Clendon, who had been primed beforehand, ventured to give it as his opinion that the withdrawal from the situation, leaving the rebels in the Par, would add greatly to their numbers, and enable them to take to the bush and do much mischief. Colonel Despard, who was suffering very much at the time from neuralgia, and had been for several days, replied, "What am I to do? Quite 1/3 of my men are either killed or disabled. If the rebels from the Par were to come out in force and line the bush all around, I have not sufficient men to go out against them." The reply to this was, "You have Wacka here with his men for such work as that, should it be needed. But the rebels are not likely to leave their Par in any force to attack you so long as you are here." The Colonel was now informed that Wacka meant to remain even if the troops were withdrawn, and what he would ask for would be some help in strengthening the stockade his men had put up on the flat a little way to the rear of the camp. Colonel Despard was further informed that it was reported on very good authority that a proposition had been made by Kawiti to desert the present Par and withdraw to the neighbourhood of Ruapekapeka. It was also suggested to the Colonel by Mr. Clendon that the 32-pound gun, lately brought in the North Star, might be so placed as to do much more execution than it had hitherto done. After some further conversation we withdrew, and immediately afterward the order to strike tents, etc., was countermanded. During the day the gun was dragged some way further up Wacka's Hill, and a steady fire from thence opened upon the Par. At my suggestion, the few wounded who were still in the camp were removed to the Waimate. We numbered now altogether about 30 in hospital. The drays have been sent to Kerikeri for further supplies of ammunition, etc. Tuesday and Wednesday, July the 8th and 9th. The heavy gun has been used yesterday and today, also 2 or 3 of the smaller ones, but for want of shot the 32-pounder was only fired at fixed intervals. A party of Wacka's men made their way to the back of the Par with a view to draw the rebels out, but the larger number remained within their fortification. Some skirmishing took place today and Wednesday, in which one of Wacka's men was wounded, but the loss on Kawiti's side we had no means of ascertaining. Thursday, July the 10th. Firing from the batteries today. It is evident the rebels in the Par are ill at ease. There has been a great deal of loud talking, the wind blowing from the south-west, the voices could be distinctly heard. Wacka's men on the hill reported that they had observed much more moving about in the Par than usual. Friday, July the 11th. Expecting from what I heard and saw yesterday that the rebels would not remain much longer in the Par, I left one of my natives in Wacka's camp with a horse ready for him to fetch me if anything unusual occurred before my return in the morning. Just at day dawn he tapped at my bedroom window and informed me that the Par was deserted and that Wacka's men were in possession before he left. By the time it was well daylight I was at the camp, and in making my way towards the Par I had very clear proof that the troops were in possession. Our soldiers were streaming out with kits or bags of potatoes, kumaras, and such other odds and ends as they could find, but the booty was not large. It was evident that the rebels had been preparing for 2 or 3 days to leave. Hearing that a native woman had been found in the Par and made prisoner, I was anxious to see her, and was making straight for the hut where she had been placed, when I was reminded by the sentry who had been placed over the prisoner that I must not speak to her without authority from the officer on duty. I went direct to the Colonel, and was glad to find him much more cheerful and better than he had been for several days past. He asked if I had any idea where the rebels had gone. I was able to reply so far that it was not customary for natives when they deserted a Par to make for one spot unless they had another Par ready, which in this case I knew they had not. Moreover, that on my way I had seen several parties going in different directions, some evidently bound for Whangaroa, that the larger number had probably gone towards Kaikohe. To the Colonel's inquiry as to whether it would be of any use to attempt to follow up the rebels, I replied, none whatever. With the Colonel's consent I visited the prisoner, who was crouched in one corner of the hut in which she had been placed, but in attempting to speak to her I found she was quite deaf. This, indeed, had been the cause of her having been left behind, for she was ignorant, when she was roused by the entrance of Waka's men, that the pa had been deserted. As I led her to the camp, she was immediately recognised as a relative of Adam Clarke, whose people were with Waka. 2 or 3 of the women in the pa came forward to have a tangi cry over her, but I had to tell them that they must postpone it until I had obtained her liberty, which was soon granted by the Colonel. As the rebels had told us on our inquiry for the body of Captain Grant that they had buried it at the rear of the pa, a search was made, and after a little while it was found not more than 2 feet below the surface. It was taken up and sent into the Waimate. The partial destruction of the pa is going on to-day. The 2 guns mentioned above as having been fished up out of the mill pond at Waimate were found inside. One had been disabled some days before, the other had been but of little use to the rebels. The Colonel, after examining the construction of the pa, said, "These natives must have had some European among them experienced in the art of fortifications," but I was able to assure him that they had no one with them but their own people, with probably 2 or 3 men from one of the South Sea Islands. The Colonel then ventured to speak very positively that the prodigious work done in the erection and fortifying of the pa could not possibly have been done since the attack at Maui on May the 9th. I was able to reply that I was on the spot some fortnight after Heke and Kawiti had deserted the pa at Maui, and saw the men busy clearing the fern and scrub which was then growing thereon, and that at that date Heke and Kawiti were not even agreed as to the locality where the next pa should be built. "Impossible," replied Colonel Despard. "The work could not have been done in time." As I was not disposed to argue the point, I walked away. Saturday, July the 12th. Was sent for about 2 o'clock this morning to Lieutenant Beattie, who had for the last day or 2 given hopes that he might recover, but was now dying. I had scarcely time to offer a short prayer before he was gone. Poor fellow! He was in much earnest about his state from the time he had received the wound, which proved fatal, and let us not doubt that his and our prayers were heard and answered. He was greatly beloved by both his brother officers and his men. 2 dead bodies belonging to the rebel party had been left with them in one corner of the pa when they deserted it. These were put on one side yesterday, and I went out to look to the burying of them, but found that some of Waka's people had done it overnight. It is one of the melancholy features in this war that near relatives have sometimes been fighting on opposite sides. When skirmishing first commenced between Waka's and Heke's men, it several times happened to my knowledge that in the evening men from the opposite parties met, and described their manner of skirmishing against each other during the day. Sunday, July the 13th. Our usual services. An opportunity was given to-day for church parade, but not taken advantage of. Heard in the evening that preparations are being made at the camp to remove in here to-morrow. Monday, July the 14th. The whole force left Ohio this morning, and have returned to their more comfortable quarters at the Waimate, where all are active, settling themselves in their old quarters. Now for the disappearance of our fences for firewood, etc. The work of destruction has already begun. End of Part 6.